Let's start with first one, the Index of Forbidden Books. In the mid-16th century, as the Renaissance was flourishing and scientific thought was beginning to challenge long-held beliefs, the Catholic Church wielded immense power not only over religious matters but over knowledge itself. They controlled what could be read, what could be studied, and what ideas were allowed to flourish. And so, in 1559, Pope Paul IV published the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of books considered dangerous to the faith, dangerous to the very fabric of society. Picture this: you're a scholar in Renaissance Europe, your mind buzzing with new ideas about science, art, or philosophy. You've just finished reading a book that challenges the way you view the world, maybe a work by Copernicus, suggesting that the Earth isn't the center of the universe. But you suddenly discover that this book, and others like it, has been placed on the Index of Forbidden Books. From now on, it's illegal to own, read, or distribute it. You, as a thinker, are left in a precarious position: challenge the Church, or keep your revolutionary ideas to yourself. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum was no ordinary list. Over time, it became a massive catalogue of censored knowledge, including works from some of the most important thinkers in human history. Descartes, whose philosophical writings posed a threat to the Church's doctrines. Even works of literature and political theory made the list, from Machiavelli to Dante's Divine Comedy, works that are now considered pillars of Western thought. The Church wasn't just banning books. It was shaping the narrative of what could and couldn't be known. In an era when literacy and knowledge were expanding, this kind of control was a way to maintain power. The Church believed that by controlling information, it could control the minds of its followers, keeping dangerous ideas from spreading. And for centuries, the Index remained, revised and expanded multiple times as new books and new ideas emerged. By forbidding access to certain ideas, the Index delayed scientific progress and kept Europe in the intellectual stranglehold of outdated beliefs. How different might our understanding of the universe be today if Copernican and Galilean ideas were freely debated in their own time? But censorship didn't stop at banning ideas outright. There were more insidious ways in which knowledge was controlled. In many cases, books were allowed to be published only after they were heavily censored, their most controversial passages removed or rewritten. Authors would find their works edited, stripped of the bold ideas that had made them revolutionary in the first place. In this way, censorship didn't just suppress knowledge, it manipulated it, turning what could have been radical challenges into watered-down versions that conformed to the Church's standards. The great works of Voltaire, Rousseau, and even the plays of Shakespeare found themselves scrutinized, censored, or outright banned. It was a war not just on knowledge, but on the very essence of human creativity and freedom of thought. The Index persisted for over 400 years, officially ending in 1966. But by then, its legacy had left a deep imprint on the history of thought. How many ideas that could have advanced human understanding were lost, buried, or delayed because they were deemed too dangerous to be heard? How many ideas that could have reshaped the world never had the chance to take root? The Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books was one of the earliest and longest-lasting examples of institutional censorship. But as the world moved into the 20th century, new forms of censorship emerged, this time in the political sphere. Governments, too, sought to control not just what people could read, but how they understood their own history. Our next case takes us to the heart of the US government, where a hidden truth about one of the most controversial wars in modern history was on the verge of being exposed. Case 2. The Pentagon Papers. In 1971, the United States found itself embroiled in one of the most divisive conflicts in its history, the Vietnam War. As public opinion turned increasingly against the war, the US government was hiding a devastating truth about the conflict, one that would soon be exposed to the world in a battle over censorship that shook the very foundation of American democracy. At the heart of this controversy were the Pentagon Papers, a classified Department of Defense study detailing the US government's secret involvement in Vietnam, dating back to the 1940s. The study revealed that successive US administrations had misled both the public and Congress about the scale and scope of the war. Despite knowing that the conflict was unlikely to end in a clear victory, officials continued to escalate military involvement, leading to the loss of countless lives. This damning evidence might have remained buried had it not been for Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst who had worked on the Pentagon Papers. Ellsberg, deeply disillusioned by the government's deception, made a fateful decision. He would leak the classified documents to the press, believing the American people had the right to know the truth. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times published the first of a series of articles based on the Pentagon Papers. They detailed how multiple presidents had misled the public about the Vietnam War's progress and concealed the real reasons behind the U.S.'s involvement. The documents confirmed what many Americans had long suspected, that the government had been dishonest about the war's costs, its purpose, and its likelihood of success. The response from the U.S. government was swift. President Richard Nixon, enraged by the leak, saw the release of the Pentagon Papers as a threat not just to national security but to his authority. His administration quickly filed a lawsuit, seeking to prevent the New York Times from continuing to publish the documents. The government claimed that the release of such sensitive information posed a direct threat to the safety of American troops and national interests. But this wasn't just about censorship, it was a test of the First Amendment, the constitutional right to freedom of the press. The New York Times and other newspapers argued that the public had the right to know what the government had been hiding. The case quickly escalated, reaching the U.S. Supreme Court in a landmark battle over free speech and government secrecy. In a decision that would define the limits of censorship in modern America, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press. By a 6-3 vote, the court determined that the government had not met the heavy burden of proof required to justify prior restraint, essentially censorship, of the media. Justice Hugo Black, writing for the majority, declared, "Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government." The victory for the press was not just a legal win, it was a victory for transparency and accountability. The Pentagon Papers exposed the dangers of government secrecy and the lengths to which those in power would go to maintain control over public perception. In the wake of the ruling, newspapers across the country continued to publish portions of the Pentagon Papers, and the truth about the Vietnam War reached millions of Americans. Yet the battle over censorship didn't end with the Supreme Court's decision. Daniel Ellsberg, the man responsible for leaking the documents, faced serious legal repercussions. He was charged under the Espionage Act, a law designed to prosecute spies and those who leaked national security information. If convicted, he could have spent the rest of his life in prison. But in a twist worthy of a political thriller, Ellsberg's case was thrown out due to government misconduct, including illegal wiretapping and evidence tampering by Nixon's administration. The battle over the Pentagon Papers exposed how even in democratic societies, censorship can be wielded in the name of national security to keep the public in the dark. But while the United States ultimately upheld the rights of the press in this case, not all nations have been as willing to let the truth surface. Meanwhile, in Iran, a very different struggle was unfolding. In the late 1970s, as the Iranian people rose up against a monarchy, both the regime and the revolutionaries turned to censorship as a means to control the narrative. What began as a movement for freedom quickly became a fight over who would control the future of the nation, and the flow of information was at the center of it all. Case 3: Censorship during the Iranian Revolution. In 1979, the world watched as Iran underwent one of the most significant political upheavals in modern history. The Iranian Revolution led to the overthrow of the Pahlavi monarchy and the establishment of an Islamic republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. But as the revolution unfolded, a battle was waged not just in the streets but through the control of information. Both the Shah's regime and the revolutionaries relied heavily on censorship and media manipulation to shape the narrative and control public opinion, turning censorship into a pivotal weapon. Under the Shah, censorship was already a key tool for maintaining control. The monarchy heavily censored the press, limiting discussions around political opposition, human rights abuses, and any criticism of the regime. The government banned books, shut down newspapers, and imprisoned journalists who dared challenge the official narrative. One of the most notable victims of this censorship was Ali Shariati, a revolutionary intellectual whose works criticized both the monarchy and Western imperialism. Shariati's writings, which inspired many revolutionaries, were banned by the Shah's regime, and his death under suspicious circumstances only fueled the growing unrest. In the 1970s, as opposition to the Shah grew, media outlets became even more tightly controlled. State-run television and radio broadcast a sanitized version of events, portraying Iran as a modern, progressive state under the benevolent rule of the Shah. Behind the scenes, however, dissent was growing. The regime's secret police, Savak, were notorious for their brutal crackdowns on dissent, often silencing activists, intellectuals, and religious leaders through imprisonment, torture, or worse. But while censorship temporarily kept dissent out of the public eye, it only intensified the anger brewing beneath the surface. As the revolution gained momentum in 1978, the battle over information became even more critical. Protesters took to the streets, demanding the Shah's ouster. But these protests were not widely reported by the Iranian press, which remained under strict government control. Instead, the state media portrayed the unrest as isolated and minor, a far cry from the nationwide movement that was building. Despite government efforts to suppress the voices of opposition, the revolutionaries found ways to circumvent censorship. Underground pamphlets, secretly printed and distributed, spread news of the protests and the regime's brutal response. These pamphlets also contained revolutionary messages, calling for the establishment of an Islamic government and condemning the Shah's Western alliances. Additionally, cassette tapes of speeches by exiled leaders like Ayatollah Khomeini were smuggled into Iran and circulated among the population. These tapes, which denounced the Shah's regime and called for its overthrow, became one of the most powerful tools for mobilizing public support for the revolution. The regime's grip on information loosened even further as international media began to cover the protests. Foreign journalists, initially restricted by the government, managed to document the scale of the demonstrations and the state's violent crackdowns. Footage of the mass protests, along with reports of police and military brutality, reached the outside world, countering the Shah's narrative of calm and control. This international attention further undermined the regime's credibility, showing the world the reality of the revolution and amplifying the voices of the Iranian people. As the revolution neared its climax in early 1979, the state's censorship apparatus collapsed. The floodgates of information opened, and the Iranian people could finally see the full scale of the uprising. The Shah fled the country in January 1979, and by February, the revolution had succeeded. But the end of the Shah's regime did not mark the end of censorship in Iran. After the revolution, the new Islamic Republic, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, quickly established its own system of control over information. Many of the same tools the Shah had used, banning books, silencing dissent, and controlling the press, were now employed by the new regime to consolidate its power. Newspapers that had supported the revolution were shut down for criticizing the new government, and political dissidents were arrested or exiled. One of the most notable forms of censorship post-revolution was the crackdown on women's rights activists and secular intellectuals. The new regime imposed strict Islamic laws, and those who protested, especially women's rights groups, found themselves silenced. Their protests, like those during the Shah's reign, were suppressed, and their voices erased from the new narrative of the Islamic Republic. In the case of the Iranian Revolution, we saw how control over information became a decisive factor in shaping the outcome of a nation's future, both before and after the Shah's fall. The battle for truth wasn't just fought in the streets, but in the media and through the suppression of dissenting voices. But the clash between power and knowledge is not new. Now, we travel back centuries to another pivotal moment in history where censorship wasn't just political, but deeply rooted in the conflict between science and religion. In the early 17th century, Galileo Galilei's revolutionary ideas about the cosmos threatened the very foundations of authority, leading to a trial that symbolized the dangers of suppressing truth in the name of preserving control. Case 4, the Galileo Affair. In the early 17th century, the Catholic Church found itself at odds with one of the most revolutionary minds of the scientific world, Galileo Galilei. The conflict between Galileo and the Church is a classic example of how censorship has been used not just to suppress ideas, but to halt the progress of science itself. Galileo's discoveries about the cosmos, though grounded in observation and mathematics, challenged the prevailing worldview held by the Church, leading to one of history's most famous acts of intellectual censorship. At the heart of the controversy was Galileo's support for the heliocentric model of the solar system, which posited that the Earth and other planets revolved around the Sun. This idea, first proposed by Nicholas Copernicus nearly a century earlier, was still considered heretical because it contradicted the geocentric model, the belief that Earth was the center of the universe, a view long upheld by the Church and rooted in Scripture. In 1610, Galileo's observations through his newly improved telescope revealed evidence that supported the heliocentric model. He saw the moons of Jupiter orbiting the planet, proving that not everything revolved around the Earth. These discoveries were published in his book, Sidereus Nuncius, The Starry Messenger, and quickly made Galileo a renowned figure in Europe. But while many scientists were intrigued by his findings, the Church saw them as a direct challenge to its authority over both spiritual and worldly matters. As Galileo continued to advocate for the heliocentric theory, his ideas gained traction among intellectuals, but they also attracted the ire of church officials. In 1616, the Catholic Church formally declared the heliocentric theory to be heretical, stating that it contradicted the literal interpretation of certain Bible passages. Galileo was warned not to publicly support or defend Copernican views, though he was allowed to continue his research privately. For a time, Galileo complied, but his passion for discovery eventually brought him into direct conflict with the Church again. In 1632, he published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a work that subtly but clearly argued in favor of the heliocentric model. The book was presented as a conversation between supporters of both the geocentric and heliocentric views, but it was evident where Galileo's sympathies lay. The Church, already sensitive to challenges to its authority during the Counter-Reformation, saw this as an outright provocation. Galileo was summoned to Rome and put on trial by the Roman Catholic Inquisition in 1633. He was charged with heresy for advocating a view that had been explicitly forbidden by the Church. Under intense pressure, and likely fearing for his life, Galileo recanted his support for the heliocentric model. He famously muttered, "E pur si muove," and yet, it moves a defiant whisper that, while apocryphal, symbolizes the tension between scientific truth and institutional censorship. As a result of the trial, Galileo was placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life, his works were banned, and the heliocentric theory was officially deemed false by the Church. This act of censorship delayed the acceptance of a scientifically proven reality, creating a deep and lasting divide between the realms of science and religion. However, despite the Church's attempts to suppress his ideas, Galileo's work would eventually transcend the efforts to silence it. In the decades and centuries following his death, scientists such as Isaac Newton built upon Galileo's discoveries, and the heliocentric model was eventually accepted as fact. The Church's stance on Galileo softened over time, and in 1992, nearly 360 years after his trial, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged that the Church had been wrong to condemn Galileo. Galileo's battle with the Church wasn't just a fight over science, it was a struggle over who had the authority to define truth. Centuries later, this same battle for control over knowledge played out in an even more chilling way under one of history's most notorious regimes. In Soviet Russia, Joseph Stalin took censorship to a new level, not only silencing dissenting voices but erasing them entirely from existence. In this final case, we'll see how Stalin used censorship not just to suppress ideas, but to manipulate history itself. Final case: Soviet censorship under Stalin. The chilling image of Joseph Stalin's iron grip over the Soviet Union isn't just one of authoritarian control, it's also one of censorship so absolute, it reached into every corner of society. From books to art, even the very memories of people were systematically erased, altered, or hidden from view. Under Stalin, censorship didn't just stifle dissent, it rewrote history itself. To truly understand how deeply censorship was woven into Soviet society, imagine the infamous photo of Stalin standing with his political allies, men who, at one time, were his closest comrades. Now imagine those same men being systematically erased from those photos as they fell out of favor or were executed during Stalin's purges. These vanished individuals weren't just removed from the Soviet narrative, they were removed from existence, leaving behind no trace of their contributions or even their lives. This manipulation of history is perhaps one of the most terrifying forms of censorship. It wasn't just about preventing people from reading certain books or hearing dangerous ideas. Under Stalin, censorship became a tool of total control over reality itself. By erasing dissenters from photos, speeches, and history books, Stalin could rewrite the past to fit his narrative and justify his hold on power. But censorship under Stalin went far beyond photos. The Soviet government tightly controlled every aspect of culture. Writers, artists, filmmakers, anyone who produced content for public consumption were subject to strict government oversight. Works that didn't align with the state's ideology were banned, and those who dared to challenge the regime risked imprisonment or death. Take the case of Boris Pasternak, the celebrated Russian author who penned the now iconic novel Dr. Zhivago. His book, which chronicled the Russian Revolution and its aftermath, was banned in the Soviet Union for its critical portrayal of the Bolsheviks. Despite its widespread acclaim abroad, where it even won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Pasternak's work was considered too dangerous for Soviet citizens to read. The regime feared that the truth about the revolution, as seen through Pasternak's eyes, could undermine the government's carefully constructed narrative. And then there's Anna Akhmatova, one of Russia's greatest poets, who became a symbol of the intellectual class that Stalin sought to silence. Akhmatova's poetry, which captured the horrors of Stalin's regime, was banned, and she herself was forbidden from publishing in the Soviet Union. Her son was imprisoned, and many of her friends were executed in the purges. Yet, despite this repression, her words survived, smuggled out of the country or memorized by her devoted followers. Her defiance through poetry was a powerful act of resistance against a regime that sought to control not just actions, but thoughts. Under Stalin, censorship also extended to science. Researchers who pursued lines of inquiry that didn't align with Soviet ideology found themselves silenced, their work dismissed as bourgeois pseudoscience. A tragic example of this is Trofim Lysenko, a Soviet biologist whose flawed agricultural theories were embraced by Stalin because they aligned with the state's goals. Lysenko's influence led to the suppression of genetic science, with disastrous consequences for Soviet agriculture and countless lives lost to famine. And then there's the terrifying reality of censorship as a tool for controlling public memory. When Leon Trotsky, one of the key architects of the Russian Revolution, fell out of favor with Stalin, he wasn't just exiled, he was erased. Trotsky's name was scrubbed from Soviet history books, his image removed from photos, and his contributions to the revolution downplayed or ignored entirely. Stalin's message was clear: only those who were loyal to him deserved a place in Soviet history. For decades, the people of the Soviet Union were subjected to a version of history that had been carefully curated to serve the state's interests. The true horrors of the purges, the labor camps, the famines, they were all hidden from view. The state-controlled media spun a narrative of Soviet prosperity and success, while behind the scenes, millions suffered. But as with all censorship, the truth eventually came to light. After Stalin's death, the Soviet government began to acknowledge some of the atrocities committed under his rule. Trotsky's role in the revolution was gradually restored, and writers like Pasternak and Akhmatova were finally recognized for their contributions to Russian literature. Yet the legacy of Stalin's censorship lingers. The scars of those erased from history, the art and ideas that were lost, and the generations of Soviets who grew up in a world shaped by lies, all of these are a testament to the dangers of censorship when it is used as a tool of oppression. Throughout history, censorship has been used to silence voices, control narratives, and shape the course of events. From the suppression of revolutionary ideas in books to the erasure of individuals from photographs, these cases reveal a recurring truth. Those in power often fear information as much as they do rebellion. But as we've seen, while censorship can delay the truth, it can rarely erase it entirely. The stories we've explored, from Galileo's trial to the censorship of the Iranian Revolution, show that the fight for free expression is far from over. The consequences of silencing ideas have reshaped entire societies, and even today, we continue to grapple with who controls the flow of information. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Your engagement means a lot, whether you're a long-time subscriber or just passing by. If you enjoyed the content and found it insightful, feel free to give it a comment or feedback, it really helps. And if you haven't subscribed yet, We'd love to have you join us for more stories that challenge the way we see the world. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.